Think about what you did today. Not the highlights, not the parts you would tell someone about. The actual texture of the day, from the moment you opened your eyes. The alarm, the reaching for your phone before you were even fully conscious. The decisions about what to eat, what to wear, whether you had time to shower before the first thing you had to be at. The commute, or the walk to the next room, if you work from home. The hours at a screen, the meetings, the messages, the tasks that generated more tasks. The lunch that you probably ate too fast. The afternoon that felt longer than the morning. The commute back, or the closing of the laptop. The evening where you were too tired to do much, but not tired enough to sleep well. The lying awake at some point in the dark, thinking about tomorrow. Now ask yourself one question. Is this what humans were built for? For 99% of the time our species has existed on this earth, there were no alarms, no screens, no commutes, no performance reviews, no mortgages, no careers, no Monday mornings. The human body and brain you are living inside right now were shaped, refined, and optimized by 300,000 years of a completely different kind of day. And tonight, we are going to live that day. From the moment the ancient sun came up, to the moment the ancient fire burned low, and the stars appeared overhead, we are going to follow one of your ancestors through every hour of a day that your body still remembers, even though your life has completely forgotten it. What you discover might change how you think about everything you do. And by the time we reach the end of this night together, you may find that the tiredness you carry, the restlessness, the sense that something is slightly off about the way modern life is arranged, makes considerably more sense than it did before. Let your body settle now. Let the weight of your own day begin to release from your shoulders and your jaw and the muscles behind your eyes. We are going back a long way, 300,000 years, to a morning that looked nothing like yours, and yet contained something that your body has been trying to return to every single day since. The morning begins without an alarm. This is the first thing to understand about the ancient human day, and it is more significant than it might initially seem. The body of a person living 300,000 years ago had no external device forcing wakefulness at a predetermined moment. Sleep ended when the body decided sleep was finished, cued by the gradual lightening of the sky, the temperature change that accompanied dawn, and the sounds of the world coming back to life around the camp. The birds knew first, as they always do. Their calls began in what still seemed like darkness, and those calls were the signal that the night was ending and the day was ready to begin. Waking up this way, gradually, in response to biological cues rather than electronic interruption, produces a fundamentally different quality of consciousness than alarm-driven waking. Researchers studying sleep inertia, the groggy disorientation that follows being pulled from sleep before the body is ready, have found that forced early waking suppresses the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for decision-making, emotional regulation, and clear thinking, for anywhere from 15 minutes to 4 hours after waking, depending on the depth of sleep that was interrupted. The modern experience of waking to an alarm and feeling foggy, irritable, and not quite present is not a personal failing. It is a predictable neurological consequence of interrupting a process the body had not finished. Your ancient ancestor woke up without that fog, because they woke up when they were done sleeping, not a moment before. What does camp look like in the early morning? The fire from the night before is still breathing, reduced to coals but alive enough to rebuild from. Someone adds wood, and the flame comes back. The air is cool, carrying whatever the night left behind. In Africa, where our species first emerged, the early morning air has a particular quality that anyone who has spent time there recognizes immediately. Clean, slightly damp from the night, carrying the smell of the grass and the earth before the heat of the day burns all of that away. The camp is a small cluster of people, perhaps 15, perhaps 25. Not a village, not a settlement in any fixed sense. A group of related individuals, moving through a landscape together, using it without permanently altering it, reading it, the way we now read screens. Breakfast is informal and social. If last night's hunt was good, there is meat. If gathering had been productive in the days before, there are tubers, nuts, berries, whatever the season and the landscape offer. The diet of a hunter-gatherer is something modern nutritionists have studied with increasing attention in recent decades, and what they have found is striking. Archaeological analysis of skeletal remains from the Paleolithic period consistently shows something unexpected. Our ancient ancestors were healthier than the people who came after them, taller than early farmers, with better bone density, with teeth that show far less decay than the grain-heavy diets of agricultural civilizations produced, with less arthritis in their spines because they were not performing the repetitive, mechanical labor that plowing and planting and harvesting required. The bones tell the story with a clarity that no other evidence can match. Hunter-gatherers were, by the evidence of their own skeletons, thriving. This is not romanticism, it is the archaeological record, and it should surprise us, because everything we have been taught to assume about prehistoric life points the other way. We picture the ancient human as perpetually hungry, perpetually cold, perpetually one bad day away from death. The evidence says something different. The evidence says that for most of the 300,000 years our species has existed, most people, most of the time, were doing remarkably well. Now the morning is properly underway, and here is where the day diverges most dramatically from your own. After breakfast, a group of perhaps 4 or 5 adults decides to go out. Some days, this means hunting. Some days, it means gathering. Some days, it means neither, because the food stored from 2 days ago is still adequate, and there is no particular reason to expend energy today. This is one of the most important things to understand about the hunter-gatherer relationship with work. It was not continuous. It was not obligatory, in the way that employment is obligatory. It was responsive. You went out when there was reason to go out, and you did not go out when there was not. The anthropologist Richard Lee made this discovery in 1963, and it changed the course of anthropological thinking. Lee had gone to live among the Juhosi people of the Kalahari Desert in Botswana, one of the last remaining populations living in a way that closely resembles pre-agricultural human life. He expected to find people working constantly, struggling against constant scarcity, spending every available moment in the exhausting business of keeping themselves alive. What he found instead made him question nearly everything he had assumed about human prehistory. The Juhoansi adults worked an average of 12 to 19 hours per week on subsistence activities. That is fewer hours than most modern people spend commuting. The rest of the time, they did whatever they wanted. Lee's findings were initially controversial. Other anthropologists, conditioned by the same assumptions about primitive life, questioned his methodology, his definitions, his sample size. So more studies followed. The Hadza of Tanzania, the Ake of Paraguay, the Agta of the Philippines, the Matu of Australia. Every study, conducted independently in different environments, on different continents, using different methodologies, returned results that clustered around the same finding. Hunter-gatherers, in functioning groups with adequate territory, worked somewhere between 15 and 25 hours per week to meet all their needs. The remainder of their time was leisure. A University of Cambridge study that was particularly persuasive because it could compare, within the same population, found that Agta people who continued foraging spent about 20 hours a week on subsistence work, while Agta, who had transitioned to farming, worked about 30 hours a week. The farmers were working more to eat less well. This is what the transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture actually looked like at the level of individual human lives. Not progress, not liberation from toil, but more toil, for more people, producing more food that was less varied and less nutritious than what the forest and the savanna had freely offered. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. This morning, on this day, 300,000 years ago, the hunting group is heading out, and the hunt itself is something worth understanding in detail, because it is one of the most extraordinary things the human body can do, and almost nobody knows it. Humans are persistence hunters. The phrase sounds simple, but the reality it describes is astonishing. We are the only species on Earth capable of running down any other animal over a long enough distance. Not because we are the fastest. We are nowhere near the fastest. A lion reaches 60 miles per hour. A cheetah can push 80. An antelope can sustain speeds that would leave most human athletes gasping after 100 yards in a sprint. Every animal on the African savanna can outrun a human being without particular effort. But there is one thing no other large animal can do that humans can do without even thinking about it. We can sweat. Most large mammals regulate their body temperature by panting. Panting works well at rest, but becomes increasingly ineffective during sustained running, because breathing and running create competing demands on the respiratory system. An animal being chased at full speed eventually reaches a point where its body temperature rises faster than panting can dissipate the heat. It overheats. It must slow down or stop. A human chasing that animal is also generating heat, but the 2 to 4 million sweat glands distributed across the human body's surface are evaporating water and cooling the body continuously and efficiently. Combined with our upright posture, which reduces direct sun exposure compared to a four-legged animal, and our ability to breathe independently of our running stride, which most quadrupeds cannot do, humans are essentially the only animal that gets more efficient at thermoregulation as a chase extends. The persistence hunt works like this. A hunter identifies an animal, often in the heat of the midday when heat stress is highest. They begin to follow it. The animal runs away easily, leaving the human far behind, but the human keeps moving in the same direction, tracking the animal by its footprints, by the disturbed grass, by knowledge of the landscape and the animal's likely behavior. The animal rests when it thinks it has escaped. The human arrives. The animal runs again. This cycle repeats over the course of 2, 3, 4 hours. Eventually, the animal's body temperature has risen to a level it cannot sustain, and it stops and cannot run anymore. The hunter walks up to it and kills it at close range. Louis Liebenberg, a South African researcher who documented and participated in persistence hunts with San Bushmen in the 1980s and 1990s, described what he called the cognitive demands of the hunt as being among the most intellectually sophisticated activities any human performs. The hunter must simultaneously track the animal's physical signs, model the animal's behavior and likely responses, read the landscape for shortcuts and likely resting spots, monitor their own physical state, calculate the trajectory that will minimize the hunt's duration, and make continuous real-time adjustments to all of these variables as conditions change. Liebenberg argued that this kind of complex, integrative, hypothesis-driven cognition was not primitive at all. It was the cognitive activity that shaped the human brain into what it is. When the hunt succeeds, and it does not always succeed, the animal is butchered at or near the kill site, and the meat is carried back to camp. This is another form of physical labor that modern humans rarely perform and that left no complaint in the archaeological record, because the people carrying it were strong enough that was unremarkable. 30 kilograms of meat from a successful hunt might need to be carried several kilometers. The group that went out returns, and the whole camp eats. But here is the thing, this might happen 2 or 3 times in a week, or once, or not at all if plant foods are abundant enough. The hunt is not daily labor. It is intermittent, intensive effort, followed by genuine rest, which turns out to be an extremely healthy pattern of physical activity. Modern exercise science has rediscovered this, in the form of interval training and periodized exercise. The human body, it seems, responds best to the pattern it evolved inside. Bursts of significant effort, followed by real recovery. Now it is the middle of the day, and what happens next is the part of the ancient human day that most directly contradicts everything modern productivity culture tells us about ourselves. Nothing, and then more nothing. But not the nothing of exhaustion or depression, or the collapse onto a sofa that modern tiredness produces. The nothing of creatures that are genuinely, biologically at rest because all immediate needs have been met, and there is simply no reason to be doing anything in particular. The anthropologist Polly Wiesner, whose research on the Juhohansi we will return to when the evening comes, documented the afternoon hours of a typical day in a functioning hunter-gatherer camp. Adults rested, they sat in the shade and talked. They groomed each other, the careful picking through someone else's hair that looks trivial to outside observers, and that is in fact one of the most powerful bonding behaviors in the primate repertoire. They played with children, they made things, not because the things were urgently needed, but because making things was satisfying, and because skill was a form of social currency that earned respect and reciprocity within the group. The anthropologist James Sussman, who spent decades living with and studying the Juhohansi, described watching Hadza men, in general, spend a puzzling amount of time sitting, often sleeping, in camp. He initially shared the assumption that this represented wasted time, missed opportunity, the inefficiency of a primitive culture. He eventually came to understand that he had it exactly backwards. They were not failing to do something they should have been doing. They were doing precisely what the situation called for. There was food, there was safety, the afternoon was hot, rest was the correct response. We have a word for this that carries almost entirely negative connotations in modern culture: laziness. But laziness is a social judgment dressed up as a biological assessment. The human body has no drive to labor beyond necessity. What it has is a drive to meet needs, and once needs are met, to rest and to connect. The relentless pressure toward constant productivity that defines modern working life is not a natural expression of human nature. It is a cultural demand that most human beings, for most of human history, never experienced and would not have recognized as sensible if they had. There is a reason afternoon napping appears independently in dozens of cultures around the world and is practiced by billions of people, despite being structurally discouraged. In their modern work environments, the siesta of Mediterranean cultures, the riposo of Italian tradition, the afternoon rest that appears in some form across tropical and subtropical societies worldwide, the midday rest that researchers have found occurs naturally in the body's circadian cycle, with a dip in alertness between roughly 1 and 3 in the afternoon that has nothing to do with lunch and everything to do with the body's innate biological schedule. These are not cultural luxuries, they are biological defaults. The modern workday that demands continuous conscious engagement from 9 in the morning until 5 or 6 in the evening is running against the body's own preferred schedule, which includes a midday rest period as naturally as it includes a nighttime sleep period. The children in camp, during this afternoon rest, are doing something that adult humans have largely lost the time and the permission for. They are playing, not structured play, with rules and coaches and schedules, unstructured, self-directed, imaginative play that serves a function that developmental psychologists have been trying to fully articulate for decades. Archaeological evidence of children's play in the prehistoric world includes small footprints in cave clay that show children running and jumping without apparent purpose. Handprints in cave paintings placed at heights consistent with children being lifted to reach. Miniature versions of adult tools found at sites that appear to be play areas rather than functional workshops. The theoretical anthropologist Helen Fisher has argued that play in young humans serves not primarily to develop physical skills, though it does that, but to develop the capacity for what she calls flexible thinking, the ability to imagine alternative realities, to pretend that something is other than what it is, to suspend present conditions in favor of an imagined scenario. This capacity for hypothetical thinking, for modeling what is not the case in order to plan what might be the case, is one of the defining cognitive characteristics of our species, and it appears to develop primarily through the experience of unstructured play in childhood, through the hours of making things up and inhabiting imaginary worlds that children naturally and strongly prefer to spend their time in when given the choice. Modern children spend dramatically less time in this kind of play than children of any previous generation. The reasons are structural. The built environments of modern cities are not designed for children's independent movement and play. Parental anxiety, in many cases perfectly rational given traffic and stranger danger, and other genuinely elevated modern risks, keeps children indoors and supervised. And screens provide an alternative to the boredom that in previous generations would have driven a child outside to find something to do. The research on what this shift means for children's development and mental health is not encouraging. Rates of childhood anxiety and depression have risen consistently alongside the decline of unstructured outdoor play. This is almost certainly not a simple coincidence. But back to our afternoon in camp, where the children are chasing each other through the tall grass, and one of the older boys has found a remarkable rock and is showing it to anyone who will pay attention, and the adults are resting in the shade, and the fire is burning low in the heat of the day, and somewhere not far away, a group of women have taken their tools and walked to a specific place where they know certain edible plants can be found. Gathering, in the popular imagination, is the less interesting half of hunter-gathering. The hunt gets the drama, the persistence, the physical challenge, the moment of confrontation with an animal. Gathering sounds like picking up things that are lying on the ground. The reality is considerably more complex and considerably more impressive. Ethnobotanical studies of hunter-gatherer groups have found that individuals typically have detailed and precise knowledge of hundreds of plant species. Not simply whether a plant is edible or poisonous, but which parts of which species are edible at which time of year. Which processing methods are required to neutralize toxins in certain plants that would be harmful if eaten raw? Which plants have medicinal properties and what those properties are and how they must be prepared to be effective? Which plants grow in association with other plants and what that association indicates about the broader ecology of a given area, where specific species will be found at specific times of year based on soil type, water availability, sun exposure, and seasonal temperature patterns. This knowledge is not written down anywhere. It is held in human memory, transmitted verbally, across generations, refined and updated by collective observation over thousands of years. One person's lifetime of observation added to another's and another's, accumulating into something that functions like a living library of ecological knowledge that is both far more detailed and far more practically useful than anything that could be replicated from books. The plants the gathering group returns with are processed, which is its own skilled activity. Some need to be pounded, others cooked, others soaked. The knowledge of how to process different plant foods safely is itself a significant body of expertise that had to be developed, tested, refined, and transmitted across generations. Archaeology has found evidence of plant food processing tools at sites dating back at least 300,000 years. The people using them were not doing something simple. The afternoon is now softening into evening. The angle of the light has changed. The heat of the day is beginning to release. Animals are moving again. The children have worn themselves out, and several of the younger ones are sleeping against their mothers, or near the fire. which has been built up again against the coming night. Adults who rested in the afternoon are alert and social, and comfortable in a way that the midday heat did not permit. This is when something begins to happen that may be the most important thing our ancestors ever did with their time. They start to tell stories. Polly Wiesner of the University of Utah spent years recording and analyzing conversations among the Juhohansi at different times of day. Her findings, published in 2014 in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, documented something that had been observed casually by many researchers but never systematically quantified before. The content of conversation shifted dramatically as the day moved from daylight into evening and night. During the day, conversations were practical. Who had seen animal signs where? Which plants were ready for harvest? Who owed what to whom from yesterday's division of food? Complaints about someone who was not pulling their weight, plans for tomorrow. The kind of conversation that coordinates a group of people around shared practical goals. But when the sun went down and the fire became the center of the social world, 81% of all conversation shifted to stories. Not practical discussion. Stories. And not just any stories. Stories about people who were not present. Accounts of things that had happened long ago in places far away. Tales of ancestors who had done remarkable things. Myths about how the world came to be. Jokes that played with language and expectation and made everyone laugh. Stories that circulated a set of values that defined what was admirable and what was shameful. That reinforced the social bonds that held the group together across the inevitable frictions and disappointments of shared life. Rasner argued, based on this research, that the campfire was not simply a source of heat and light. It was the original social technology, and the conversation around it, the stories told in the dark, were not entertainment in the trivial sense we sometimes use that word. They were the mechanism by which human culture was transmitted across time. The myths that became religion, the values that became law, the accumulated wisdom that became science, the narratives that became literature. All of it began in this moment, in the dark, around a fire, with someone telling a story to people who were listening. What exactly were the stories about? The archaeological record gives us some indirect evidence. The cave paintings that have survived from the Paleolithic period, images created on rock, faces, and in underground chambers by people who had no practical reason to do so, tell us something about the imaginative world these people inhabited. The Chauvet Cave in southern France contains paintings created approximately 32,000 years ago. Horses, lions, rhinoceroses, bears, rendered with perspective and shading and a sense of arrangement that required genuine artistic skill. More than 420 separate animal representations in a single cave system. Some of them show animals that were not food animals, species that were not hunted. Someone walked deep into a cave, carrying fire to see by, and spent hours painting lions that they were not going to eat and had no obvious practical reason to depict. Some researchers have argued that cave art was functional in a ritual sense, that the paintings were part of shamanic practice, that the underground chambers were sacred, spaces where contact with the spiritual world was sought. Others have argued that the paintings were teaching tools, that the careful depiction of an animal's toes anatomy and behavior was a way of transmitting hunting knowledge. Still others have suggested that adolescent boys, who appear to have made many of the handprints found in cave systems based on the size and proportion of the prints, were exploring caves and making marks, for reasons that look very much like the reasons adolescents do. Anything. Because they could. Because it was exciting. Because leaving a mark is a way of saying you were there. What all of these theories agree on is that the cave paintings represent a commitment of time and effort and skill that goes well beyond any immediate practical necessity. Someone cared about this enough to do it. Someone found it worth doing. And in a world where survival took 15 to 20 hours a week and the rest was available for other things, There was time to care about things that did not directly keep you alive. The shell beads found at Blombos Cave in South Africa and dated to approximately 100,000 years ago make the same point with even greater force. Tiny holes drilled through small seashells, clearly meant to be strung together. The nearest coastline to the excavation site was 20 kilometers away. Someone walked 40 kilometers round trip to collect shells that had no food value whatsoever, then spent hours carefully drilling precise holes through them, using stone tools, for the sole purpose of wearing them as decoration. This was not survival behavior. This was aesthetic behavior, the expression of a desire to look a certain way to other people, to signal something about identity and status and belonging through what was worn on the body. The 40,000-year-old flute, found in a cave in Germany, carved from the hollow bone of a vulture with 5 precisely spaced finger holes, represents another dimension of this. Someone understood enough about acoustics to space those holes at intervals that would produce a musically useful range of pitches. This required not just the carving skill, but the musical knowledge, the understanding of what different finger positions on a wind instrument produce. And someone cared enough about music, about the organized production of sound for its own sake, to devote significant time and skill to creating an instrument. These are not the activities of creatures in constant survival crisis. They are the activities of creatures with enough time and energy left over after meeting their basic needs to explore and express and create. And that is exactly what the evidence says they had. Now it is fully dark. The fire is the center of everything. The sounds of the night surround the camp, and those sounds include things that are genuinely dangerous. The darkness beyond the firelight is not the benign urban darkness of a bedroom with the curtains drawn. It is the darkness of a landscape where lions hunt at night, where leopards move silently through long grass, where the sounds in the dark have been meaningful to human ears for 300,000 years and before. The fire is why this is survivable, not just because of the heat and the light, but because large predators avoid fire. The circle of firelight is a circle of safety, and within that circle, the social world of the group continues long after the sun would have made it impossible. This extension of the social day into the night hours, enabled by fire, had consequences for human development that may have been more significant than any other single technological innovation in our history. Before fire, social life ended when the sun went down. After fire, it continued for 3 or 4 hours into the dark. Those 3 or 4 extra hours of daily social time, multiplied across hundreds of thousands of years, gave the human brain something to do that shaped what the human brain became. The capacity for narrative, the development of complex language, the ability to think about people who were not present, about events that had not yet happened, about the world as it might be, rather than as it simply was. All of this appears to have been developed and refined in the context of firelit evening conversation. There is a theory that the storytelling of those evening hours was not merely culturally significant, but was the actual mechanism of cognitive evolution, that the brain grew more complex, in part, because complex stories demanded more complex brains to tell and to follow, that the selection pressure for greater intelligence was not primarily the hunt, as earlier theories suggested, but the social world of the campfire. The person who could tell the most compelling story, follow the most complex narrative, model, most accurately, the intentions and motivations of other people as represented in tales about absent third parties. That person was the most socially successful, and social success, in a small group, where food sharing was the difference between survival and starvation, was the same as survival success. The stories being told tonight around this fire we are imagining carry the accumulated knowledge and values of many generations. A story about a hunt that happened before anyone present was born is not just entertainment. It contains information about how that particular animal behaves in that particular terrain, how it was tracked and taken, what went wrong, and what was done right. A story about an ancestor who did something shameful and suffered the consequences is not just a cautionary tale. It is a statement about the values the group holds and the social costs of violating them. A myth about how the world came to be is not just poetry. It is an answer to the question of how to live inside a world whose workings are not fully understood. A framework that makes the inexplicable bearable and the terrifying meaningful. The children, most of them asleep, are absorbing some of this, even in sleep. Research on how children acquire cultural knowledge has consistently found that even partial or peripheral exposure to narrative communication shapes children's developing understanding of social norms, values, and the structure of the world. You do not need to be listening attentively to a story to be learning from it. You need only to be in its presence, in the way that the children sleeping near the fire are in the faux presence of everything being said, above and around them. Sleep, when it comes in two waves. This is the discovery that historians and sleep researchers have made independently, converging on the same finding from different directions. The historian Roger Ekirch, after spending over 2 decades examining pre-industrial, historical records from across cultures and time periods, found more than 2,000 references to a pattern of sleep that no longer exists in most of the modern world. People did not sleep in one continuous block. They slept in what historical sources called the first sleep, a period of approximately 4 hours, then woke naturally in the middle of the night, stayed awake for 1 to 2 hours, then fell into the second sleep, which lasted until dawn. The psychiatrist Thomas Vare confirmed the biological basis for this pattern in a laboratory setting in the early 1990s. He exposed volunteers to 14 hours of darkness per night for a month, the approximate, natural light conditions before artificial lighting extended the evening indefinitely. Within weeks, virtually all participants had spontaneously developed a biphasic sleep pattern identical to the one Ekirch had found in the historical record. First sleep, a waking interval of 1 to 2 hours, characterized by a particular hormonal profile, including elevated prolactin levels that produced a calm, meditative quality of awareness, then second sleep until dawn. This is the original human sleep, not the consolidated 8-hour block that modern medicine has declared healthy and normal, but 2 4-hour periods with a waking interval between them. The historical sources describe what people did in that interval. They prayed, they thought, they talked quietly with whoever was near, they tended the fire, they made love, they interpreted their dreams, which they had just had, and which they believed carried information worth attending to. This middle-of-the-night wakefulness was not what we would now call insomnia. It was not distressing, it was a normal and even valued part of the night, a time of unusual clarity and quiet when thoughts came easily and the usual pressures of the day were absent. If you have ever woken at 2 or 3 in the morning in a state that was not groggy and confused, but strangely alert and clear-headed, and lay there with your thoughts moving in ways they do not usually move during the day, you have experienced what your ancestors experienced every night. Your body was doing exactly what it was built to do. The distress comes not from the waking itself, but from the belief that the waking is wrong, that you should be continuously asleep from 10 at night to 6 in the morning, that any deviation from this pattern is a symptom of something that needs to be corrected. The belief is wrong, the waking is right. Now the camp is almost entirely still, the fire burns lower, the stars, and in a world without light pollution, there are stars everywhere, the entire bowl of the sky, filled with them so densely that the Milky Way casts its own faint shadow. The stars continue their slow rotation overhead. The sounds of the night continue. Somewhere distant, a hyena calls. Something moves in the grass beyond the firelight. The night watchman, the person whose rotation it is to remain alert enough to respond to anything that requires it, continues their quiet vigil at the edge of the firelight. This ancient human day is ending, but before it does, sit with what it has been for a moment. 15 to 20 hours of activity directed toward meeting genuine needs, spread across a week rather than compressed into daily shifts. Food that was varied and fresh and required skill to obtain. Physical movement that was intermittent and purposeful rather than continuous and arbitrary. Social connection that was constant and genuine, built into the structure of the day rather than scheduled into the margins of it. Creative activity that was not squeezed into leisure time but was simply part of what people did when they had time and energy and the inclination. Rest that was real, not guilty. Sleep that followed the body's own rhythms rather than the demands of a schedule. And now, the arithmetic that is genuinely uncomfortable. You will spend approximately 90,000 hours of your life at work. That is more than 10 years of continuous waking time. Your ancient ancestor spent something closer to 12 to 19 hours per week on all the activities required to meet their needs, including gathering, hunting, processing food, making tools, and maintaining shelter. Over the course of a year, that is somewhere between 600 and 1,000 hours, you work more in 4 months than your ancestor worked in a year. 10,000 years ago, something happened that changed this equation permanently. In a region of what is now the Middle East, in the valley of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, and in the lands around the eastern edge of the Mediterranean Sea, some groups of humans began doing something that no humans had done before. They planted seeds deliberately and waited for them to grow. They tamed wild animals and kept them penned rather than hunting them in the landscape. They began the practice that we call agriculture. Agriculture is the most consequential development in the history of our species, and its consequences have been far more mixed than most people understand. The standard narrative describes agriculture as a great leap forward, as the foundation of civilization, as the development that allowed humans to escape the precarious life of the hunter and live in settled security. The archaeological and anthropological evidence tells a more complicated story. When researchers compare the skeletal remains of hunter-gatherers with those of early agricultural populations from the same regions, the farmers are consistently shorter. Their bones show evidence of nutritional deficiencies. Their teeth are riddled with cavities from the grain-heavy diets that agriculture produced, diets that were far less varied than what the hunter-gatherers before them had eaten. Their spines show arthritis from the repetitive labor of plowing and harvesting. They died younger on average. Their immune systems faced new challenges from the diseases that spread easily through settled populations living in close contact with their own waste and with domesticated animals that shared many of their pathogens. The first agricultural populations were, by the evidence of their own bones, less healthy than the hunter-gatherers who preceded them. So why did agriculture spread so quickly and so completely? Not because it made individual lives better, but because it made populations larger. More food in a fixed location meant more children could survive to adulthood. More children meant a larger group. A larger group could defend territory more effectively against smaller groups of hunter-gatherers, who, with all their health advantages, were simply outnumbered. Agriculture was not chosen because it was obviously better. It spread because once begun, it was self-reinforcing. More people needed more food, needed more farming, needed more people. Within a few generations, the populations that had adopted agriculture were too large to revert to hunting and gathering, even if they had wanted to. The old way of living required a ratio of land to people that an agricultural population could never sustain, and with agriculture came everything else. Surpluses that could be stored meant some people could be freed from food production to do other things. Those people became specialists: potters, metalworkers, scribes, priests, soldiers, administrators. The division of labor that agriculture made possible eventually produced all of civilization's achievements: architecture, writing, mathematics, philosophy, medicine. All of it traces back to the moment someone planted a seed and waited for it to grow. But it also traces back to the 90,000 hours of your life that belong to your employer, to the alarm that wakes you before your body is finished sleeping, to the afternoon fog that is your circadian system asking for a rest it will not be allowed to have, to the evening where you are too tired to do much and too wired to sleep easily. The connection is not accidental, it is structural. The agricultural mode of life required labor that was not intrinsically motivated. A hunter goes out because hunger drives them out, and stops when need is met. A farmer must plow, and plant, and weed, and harvest according to the demands of the seasonal calendar, not the demands of their body's hunger. This required a new relationship between people and time, a relationship in which time was a resource that had to be allocated and managed and accounted for, rather than simply lived inside. That relationship has intensified with every passing century, through the slave labor of ancient empires, through the feudal obligations of medieval agriculture, through the industrial work regimes that measured a worker's value in units of time, through the knowledge economy of the present in which you are expected to be available and responsive and productive for more hours per day than any previous labor system demanded of most workers. You are not built for this. Your body is built for the ancient pattern, the intermittent effort and genuine rest, the social days and the quiet evenings, the sleep that comes and goes in its own rhythm, the time for making things and telling stories and lying in the grass watching clouds. The alarm clock that drags you from your natural sleep cycle every morning is not a small inconvenience. It is a daily argument between the demands of modern life and the needs of a body that has not changed significantly in 300,000 years, an argument that your body loses every morning and carries the deficit of all day. None of this is an argument for returning to hunter-gatherer life. We cannot. There are 8 billion of us, a planet that could support perhaps 10 million hunter-gatherers in the wild lands that existed before agriculture, cannot support a fraction of its current population without care-intensive cultivation. The choice between the ancient way and the modern way was made 10,000 years ago, and the cations have multiplied so far beyond the point of reversal that the question is not whether to go back. It is what to do with the knowledge of what we came from, now that we have it. What we can do is recognize our ancient defaults and try to honor them within the constraints of modern life. Rest when rest is available, without guilt. Sleep in response to what your body needs, rather than purely to what the schedule demands. Eat food that resembles what the body evolved to process. Move in ways that feel natural, rather than compelled. Make things. Tell stories. Spend time in genuine social connection, rather than the performed connection of social media. Sit in the afternoon and let the mind wander without immediately reaching for a screen to fill the space. Go outside when possible and let the light and the temperature and the sounds of the natural world calibrate the body in the ways that 300,000 years of evolution has shaped it to need. These are not lifestyle tips. They are a partial return to the biological baseline, the conditions under which your body was designed to function. The ancient human who woke without an alarm and ate varied food and moved when movement served a purpose, and rested without shame, and sat around a fire in the evening listening to stories and fell asleep when the darkness came, and woke in the middle of the night in a state of meditative calm before sliding into a second sleep until dawn. That person was not primitive. They were calibrated. Their life was fitted to their body in a way that yours, through no fault of your own, is not. The day is ending now. This ancient day that we have followed from the first birdsong through the morning gathering, and the afternoon rest, and the evening stories, and the fire burning low. The camp is quiet. Most of the group is in their first sleep. The fire breathes slowly. The stars turn overhead with the patience they have always had. Somewhere in the grass, something calls once and then is silent. Your body, if you let it, knows exactly what to do with this moment. It has been doing it for 300,000 years. The second sleep is coming. The body is ready for it, in the way that the body is always ready for what it was built to do, when given the chance, when not interrupted, when allowed to follow the ancient rhythms that are still written into every cell. There is nothing you need to figure out tonight. There is nowhere you need to be. The stories have been told. The fire is watched. The stars are doing what they always do. Let the second sleep come. But before the second sleep fully takes you, let us sit for a while longer in the fire's warmth, and go deeper into several things we have only touched on, because the ancient human day was richer than any summary can capture. There are layers to it that deserve their own time in the light. Let us start with something that seems simple and turns out to be profound. The question of what ancient humans ate. Not just what categories of food, but the actual experience of eating. The relationship between these people and food that is so different from ours that it amounts to a completely different way of moving through the world. Every meal that a hunter-gatherer ate was earned, not in the moral sense, not as a judgment on desert or worthiness, but in the most literal physical sense. Every calorie that entered the body had been found, tracked, carried, processed, and prepared through direct personal effort, or through the effort of someone the eater knew personally and was in direct relationship with. There was no anonymity between the person and their food. You knew where it came from because you went there. You knew what it cost because you felt that cost in your legs and your shoulders and your hands. This relationship with food has essentially disappeared from modern life for most people. The food on your table has traveled an average of 1,500 miles to reach you. It has passed through systems of agriculture, processing, packaging, transportation, retail, and preparation that involve hundreds of people you will never meet and dozens of processes you cannot see. The disconnect between the person and their food is total, and this disconnect has consequences that nutritionists and public health researchers have been documenting with increasing specificity. The hunter-gatherer diet, by every metric researchers have been able to apply, was dramatically more varied than the modern Western diet. Studies of contemporary hunter-gatherer groups have found that most consume somewhere between 100 and 200 distinct plant species in the course of a year. The modern Western diet, dominated by a small number of heavily processed staple crops, contains perhaps 20 to 30 distinct plants in a typical year, and for many people considerably fewer. The gut microbiome, the community of bacteria and other microorganisms that live in the human digestive system, and that researchers are increasingly recognizing as fundamental to physical and mental health, responds to dietary variety by becoming more diverse. More diverse gut microbiomes are associated with better immune function, lower rates of inflammatory disease, better mood regulation, and greater cognitive resilience. The ancient human gut was almost certainly far more diverse than the modern one, for the simple reason that the ancient human diet was far more varied. The timing of eating was also different, in ways that align with what modern chronobiologists have found about optimal eating patterns. Hunter-gatherers ate when food was available, which typically meant eating in the morning and early afternoon, and then again after a successful hunt or gathering expedition, with extended periods of not eating between significant meals. This pattern of time-restricted eating, in which food intake is concentrated in a window of perhaps 8 to 10 hours, and the body spends the remaining 14 to 16 hours in a fasted state, has become one of the most studied interventions in metabolic health research. The evidence for its benefits, including improved insulin sensitivity, reduced inflammation, better cognitive function, and improved sleep quality, is robust and growing. Hunter-gatherers practiced it not as an intervention, but as a natural consequence of the way food was obtained. The experience of hunger itself was different. Modern people rarely experience genuine hunger, the specific physiological state that occurs when the body has depleted its immediate glycemic reserves and begun mobilizing stored energy. We eat before we are hungry, often in response to emotional or social cues rather than physiological ones. The hunter-gatherer experienced genuine hunger regularly, not as suffering, but as information. Hunger was the body's signal that it was time to go out, time to direct effort toward food acquisition. And the satisfaction of eating after genuine hunger, the specific pleasure that comes from feeding real physiological need, is a pleasure that most modern people rarely access. There is a concept in behavioral economics called the hedonic treadmill, the tendency for pleasures to lose their capacity to satisfy when they are too easily available. The first cup of coffee in a morning tastes different from the fourth. The first holiday after a period of exhausting work is more restorative than the third holiday, taken from a life that already contains too much leisure. The principle applies to food as directly as to anything else. Food that is harder to get tastes better. Food that required effort tastes more satisfying. The hunter-gatherer's relationship with food included a level of genuine anticipation, genuine effort, and genuine relief and pleasure at successful eating that most modern eating, surrounded by unlimited availability and variety, structurally cannot produce. Now let us spend some time with the question of what ancient humans understood. This is where the popular image of prehistoric humans as primitive and intellectually limited is most completely contradicted by the evidence. The cognitive demands of a hunter-gatherer existence were, in several crucial respects, greater than those of most modern lives. Consider the knowledge that a successful hunter-gatherer needed to carry: the tracks of every animal in the territory, their shape and depth, and the information they encode about the size and speed and health and direction of the animal that made them, the behavioral patterns of each species, when they move, where they go to drink, how they respond to different weather conditions, what they do when threatened, the geography of the territory in 3 dimensions, including features that are not visible from the surface, the shallow crossings in rivers, the caves that can serve as shelter, the places where specific plants concentrate, the seasonal cycles of every food source, which ripens when, which tubers are most nutritious in which month, where the bee colonies are, and when the honey will be ready, the weather patterns, and what they predict about conditions over the coming days and weeks, the social dynamics of every other group in the region, and what those dynamics mean for movement, and alliance, and potential conflict. This knowledge was not written down. It was held entirely in human memory, structured by narrative and by direct experience, refined continuously by observation, and updated by communication within the group. The researcher Louis Liebenberg, who studied San Bushman trackers in detail, described their tracking practice as requiring a form of scientific reasoning that he found genuinely impressive, forming hypotheses about animal behavior based on incomplete evidence, testing those hypotheses against new evidence encountered along the trail, revising the hypothesis when the evidence demanded it, and doing all of this in real time while simultaneously managing the physical demands of following the track. Liebenberg called it creative tracking and argued that it was one of the most cognitively sophisticated activities any human being regularly performed. The oral traditions that carried cultural knowledge across generations were themselves cognitive achievements of enormous sophistication, memorizing and accurately transmitting hundreds of narratives, each containing specific information about history, geography, social norms, spiritual practices, and ecological knowledge, across generations without the aid of writing, required memory systems of a complexity and reliability that the modern literate world has largely abandoned because it has technological alternatives. Australian Aboriginal songlines, the navigational routes encoded in sung narratives that, allowed Aboriginal people to navigate vast distances across the Australian continent with perfect accuracy, represent one of the most extraordinary examples of this. The songs were maps, the maps were songs, and the system worked for tens of thousands of years, across landscapes of millions of square kilometers, without a single written word. Modern cognitive psychology has found that the kind of memory that hunter-gatherers depended on what is called episodic memory, the memory of specific events, locations, and sensory details, is in some respects more robust than the semantic memory of facts and procedures that written culture tends to privilege. People who rely on episodic memory for navigation consistently outperform people who rely on maps or GPS in their ability to remember spatial environments in 3 dimensions, to navigate novel routes based on environmental cues, and to maintain accurate knowledge of multiple spatial relationships simultaneously. The GPS that has made navigation easy has, in the process, measurably reduced the human brain's exercise of a capacity that was once among its most important. This is a pattern that runs through the full comparison between the ancient human day and the modern one. The cognitive demands that the ancient life placed on the brain were in many ways more varied and more integrated than those that modern life requires of most people. Not harder in the sense of requiring more formal education or higher abstraction, but harder in the sense of requiring continuous integration of multiple forms of knowledge, continuous real-time response to complex and changing conditions, and continuous social and political intelligence in a context where those forms of intelligence had immediate, survival consequences. The emotional life of the ancient human is harder to reconstruct, but worth considering. The archaeological evidence, read carefully, suggests a richness of emotional experience that is easy to underestimate. The care taken in the burial of the dead, documented at sites dating back at least 100,000 years in some cases, with bodies placed in specific positions, sometimes with grave goods, sometimes with evident marks of ceremony, tells us that these people mourned, that they believed the dead deserved careful treatment, that death was not simply an event, but an occasion that called for response from the living. The elaborate decoration of the body with pigment and jewelry tells us they cared about how they appeared to others, that identity and status and beauty were meaningful to them. The music they made tells us they experienced something that organized sound could express, or amplify, or release, something we recognize as emotion even across the distance of 40,000 years. The social bonds within a hunter-gatherer group were, of necessity, intense and multidimensional in a way that most modern social relationships are not. These were people who slept near each other, ate together, worked together, cared for each other's children, made collective decisions together, and depended on each other for survival in a very direct and specific sense. The resolution of conflict within such a group required sophisticated social intelligence, because unresolved conflict in a group of 15 or 20 people who could not simply leave and be replaced had immediate and serious consequences for everyone. The ethnographic record of hunter-gatherer groups describes remarkably sophisticated mechanisms for conflict resolution, including a deeply egalitarian ethic that actively suppressed the accumulation of dominance by any individual, what anthropologists call reverse dominance hierarchy, in which attempts by any individual to dominate others are met with collective social pressure, ridicule, and if necessary, ostracism. This egalitarianism was not idealistic. It was functional. In a group of 20 people where collective food sharing was necessary for everyone's survival, allowing any individual to accumulate disproportionate power over resources was genuinely dangerous. The groups that maintained equitable sharing maintained the social cohesion that survival required. The groups that allowed the concentration of resources in the hands of a few faced internal conflict that could be fatal. The egalitarian ethos was selected for because it worked. It is worth noting what this means about the nature of inequality. The radical inequality that characterizes modern societies, in which a small number of individuals control resources equivalent to those of hundreds of millions of others, is not the natural human condition. It is a product of agriculture and the surplus storage that agriculture enabled. Once food could be accumulated and stored, it could be controlled. Once it could be controlled, it could be used as leverage. Once it could be used as leverage, hierarchies of power could be built and maintained that would casting them down, its starting them down, would levery and exceed the soaring tutor. The extreme inequality of the modern world is not an expression of human nature. It is a historical development of the last 10,000 years, built on the foundations of agricultural surplus. This is not a comfortable fact. It suggests that the social arrangements we live inside, which most people experience as simply the way things are in fact historically specific, and in some ways quite recent. They are not what human social life looks like at its baseline. They are what human social life looks like after 10,000 years of a particular set of technologies and economic arrangements that the baseline human was not designed for, none of which helps you navigate the specific demands of your specific day. The commute is still there. The alarm will still ring. The work will still need to be done. But there is something in knowing what the baseline was, in feeling the shape of the life your body was built for, that can quietly shift the way you hold the life you are actually living. The anthropologist Marshall Salins, writing in 1972 in a paper that became one of the most influential texts in the field, called The Hunter-Gatherer Life, the Original Affluent Society. Not affluent in the sense of material wealth, affluent in the sense that it provided what it was intended to provide, that needs were met, that time was available, that the people living it were, by the evidence of their bones and their art and their social arrangements and the testimony of the people who have observed them and lived among them, not suffering, not desperate, not limited by their simplicity, but free, in a way that the agricultural civilizations that came after them, and the industrial civilizations that came after those, were not, in any systematic way, designed to provide. Salins was not arguing for a return, he was offering a perspective. The hunter-gatherers, he wrote, achieved affluence because they chose wants that were easily satisfied. They had decided what enough meant and built their lives around it. The modern world has decided that enough is never enough, that more is always better, that growth is the fundamental orientation of a healthy economy, and has built its lives around that instead. Neither position is obviously correct in an absolute sense, but knowing that another position existed, that for 97% of human history, a very different answer to the question of enough was lived and found workable, is valuable information. The fire is very low now, there is just the coals, breathing orange in the darkness, enough heat to be felt, but not enough light to see by. The camp is completely quiet. The second sleep has come for everyone now. Even the night watcher has found a comfortable position and allowed their eyes to close for a moment. The stars have moved, as they always move, imperceptibly slow to any single watching eye, but unmistakably turned when you look away and look back. The east is still dark. Dawn is several hours away yet. This is the quietest part of the night, the hour when the world seems to hold its breath between the last of the dark and the first of the light. For 100,000 generations, human beings have lain in this hour and felt this particular quality of stillness, the fire's warmth, the sounds of breathing around you, the stars above, the knowledge that the people you depend on and who depend on you are close, that the night is nearly over, that the day will come again with its demands and its pleasures and its particular rewards. You are connected to all of them, by the same biology, by the same needs, by the same capacity for rest and for work, for fear and for beauty, for the particular human pleasure of telling a story in the dark and having someone else hear it and respond. The distance between you and your ancestor of 300,000 years ago is enormous in every external respect. In every internal one, it is almost nothing. Let that stillness carry you now. The second sleep is still here. The fire is still breathing. The stars are still turning. And somewhere in the ancient landscape, beyond the fire's edge, the world is going quietly about the business of being itself, as it always has, as it always will, long past any individual human mourning. Rest in this. You have earned it, in the ancient sense of that word, not through labor, through being.